A musician, well known throughout Australia, has returned to Newcastle. Michael Dudman is again the organist and master of choristers of Christchurch Cathedral, after occupying a similar position at St George's Cathedral, Perth, during the last 2 years. Michael Dudman talks with Geoff Moore.
Mr Dudman, why have you come back to Newcastle?
Well, that one's easily answered. It's because both my wife and I have a great liking for Newcastle, and professionally I feel that all sorts of exciting opportunities are open now at the cathedral for making music. I think the cathedral here is quite unique in Australia. It's a very unusual building, and both the instrument and its setting, both the organ and its setting, are going to provide some quite exciting things.
And while in Perth, were you taking part in musical activities outside the cathedral?
Yes, I was responsible for the music department in a teachers' college there, and in addition to this, we were able to bring in all sorts of outside forces into the cathedral music making, which was very fine.
What comparison would you make between the Newcastle Cathedral music scene as you left it 2 years ago and the Perth St George's Cathedral approach to music?
Well, there is common ground. Both cathedrals have choral foundations, both have choirs of men and boys, and both have a substantial repertoire of suitable music. But I think the main difference at St George's was the bringing in from outside of additional forces. We maintained the choral services and the traditional use of the organ and so forth, but we had not only concerts, but strings, brass, ballet, military bands, chamber orchestras, pop music, art exhibitions, all this sort of thing, in the context of actual services as well as at concerts and recitals. And I think this is something that has taught me a good deal.
Do you feel that there is a certain type of music that should not be played in the cathedral?
This is a difficult one. I think that there are two standards by which we can judge any piece of music, and I'm not quite sure which is the right one. There's the absolute standard, which allows us to say that the music of Mozart is wonderful and that the music of, say, Gounod is terribly bad. But then there's perhaps the standard of suitability, which applied might lead us to say that the Crucifixus from Bach's B minor Mass is splendid for a funeral, but a rotten choice, say, for a party. I think possibly we have to temper the absolute judgment with this question of suitability for a particular occasion. But I think the main sort of criterion, too, that we apply to any music is that it be well done. I've nothing against the notion of a pop group performing in the cathedral if it's there for a particular purpose, and if it's a very good one of its kind. But I should have very strenuous objections to such a group performing if it were a bad or incompetent one, just as I would have very strenuous objections to a concert given by an incompetent pianist.
Now, in a cathedral situation, what's the organist and master of the choristers, or shall we call him the musical director's, responsibility?
This can vary from place to place. First, I think his responsibility is the ordering and carrying out of the choral services, and the main choral services in this cathedral will be the Mass and Evensong. But in addition, he's responsible for arranging recitals and concerts and generally trying to bring as much light and life and colour musically into the place as he possibly can. I think that the cathedral should be a centre for the performing arts. Traditionally, this was so over the centuries, and it's really only a 19th century concept which makes churches and cathedrals places which are put aside and set apart for churchy sort of activities and not for the mainstream of artistic activities.
But do you ultimately have the responsibility for the type of music to be played in the cathedral?
Yes.
You do. What part does the dean play then?
The dean in any cathedral is in overall charge of the music and indeed of all aspects of the cathedral's life. Obviously, however, he delegates responsibility in specific areas, and the musical responsibility is delegated to the organist or director of music or what you will. Mind you, there have been some splendid confrontations over the years between deans and organists who didn't quite see it that way, but I hope that's not going to happen here, quite obviously not.
And now that you're back, Mr. Dudman, what innovations can we expect to notice in the music of Christchurch Cathedral?
I hope that perhaps the musical activity will be over a broader spectrum than was the case when I was here before. Certainly I'll hope to do everything that I was able to do before, but I think mainly in the direction of outside concerts, of trying to make the cathedral a real centre for musical activity. This will be the additional thrust of what I'm trying to do.
Geoff Moore was talking to Michael Dudman, who has just returned to Newcastle as the organist and master of choristers of Christchurch Cathedral.